The battle that taught France nothing. In the summer of 1346, Europe was witnessing the early stages of a conflict that would eventually become known as the Hundred Years' War. At its heart lay a dispute over a crown. When King Charles IV of France died in 1328 without a male heir, the French nobility selected Philip VI of the House of Valois as king. But across the English Channel, another claimant existed, Edward III of England, through his mother, Isabella of France. Edward possessed a blood claim to the French throne. At first, the English king accepted Philip's rule, yet tensions between the two monarchies continued to grow. France supported Scotland, England's traditional enemy. England depended heavily on trade with Flanders, a region economically tied to English rule, but politically influenced by France. Disputes over territory, commerce, and prestige steadily pushed the kingdoms toward war. By the 1340s, diplomacy had failed. The struggle for power would now be decided by armies. In July 1346, Edward III launched one of the most ambitious invasions in medieval history. His fleet crossed the English Channel and landed in Normandy with roughly 12,000 men. The English army was a mixture of knights, men-at-arms, and one increasingly important group, the longbowmen. Unlike many medieval rulers, Edward placed enormous trust in common soldiers armed with the English longbow. These archers, trained from childhood, were skilled longbowmen could release multiple arrows per minute and strike targets at astonishing distances. Most European nobles still believed heavily armored cavalry represented the future of warfare. Edward believed otherwise. After landing, the English army moved rapidly across Normandy. Towns were burned, villages were looted, French lands were devastated. The campaign served both military and psychological purposes. Edward wanted supplies. He wanted wealth, but he also wanted to provoke Philip VI into battle. The strategy worked. As reports of destruction reached Paris, outrage spread across France. Philip gathered one of the largest armies Europe had seen in decades. French nobles flocked to his banner. Knights arrived from every corner of the kingdom. Many believed victory was inevitable. After all, France possessed greater resources, greater population, and far more cavalry than England. The French king intended to crush Edward once and for all. Yet Edward was not interested in fighting on French terms. For weeks, the English army maneuvered through northern France while avoiding direct confrontation. The campaign became a deadly game of pursuit. French forces chased, English forces moved. Both kings searched for the perfect opportunity. Eventually, Edward crossed the Seine and then the Somme River, escaping several attempts to trap his army. The march exhausted both sides, but it also brought them closer to the decisive confrontation that Edward had wanted from the beginning. On the 26th of August 1346, the English army reached high ground near the village of Crécy and Ponthieu. Edward examined the terrain carefully. The position offered several advantages. The English stood on elevated ground. Approaching forces would need to advance uphill. Natural obstacles restricted movement. Most importantly, the battlefield gave English archers clear fields of fire. Edward immediately ordered his men to prepare defensive positions. Unlike many medieval commanders, he did not intend to launch a dramatic cavalry charge. Instead, he would force the French to attack him. It was a simple plan, but it required discipline. Throughout the afternoon, English soldiers dug in and organized their lines. Longbowmen were positioned on the flank. Men-at-arms occupied the center. Every unit understood its role. Meanwhile, the French army continued advancing. Philip VI faced a difficult problem. His forces were arriving throughout the day, Some units reached the battlefield earlier than others. The army lacked cohesion. Communication was poor, yet confidence remained high. Many French nobles could already imagine the victory celebrations. Some reportedly argued over who would have the honor of capturing Edward III. Others dismissed the English position entirely. After all, what threat could a tired invading army pose against the military elite of France? That confidence would soon become a fatal mistake. As evening approached, thousands of French troops finally arrived within sight of the English position. Among them were several thousand Genoese crossbowmen. These mercenaries were considered some of the finest missile troops in Europe. Philip intended to use them to weaken the English line before the cavalry advanced. On paper, the plan seemed reasonable, but circumstances were already turning against France. The army had marched long distances. Many soldiers were exhausted. A rainstorm had recently swept across the battlefield. The Genoese crossbow strings had become damp. The English longbowmen had protected their equipment. The French had not. Small details, tiny disadvantages, almost invisible to those preparing for battle. Yet, history often turns on details that commanders fail to notice. As the sun began to set over Crécy, two of Europe's greatest armies prepared to clash. The French expected a swift victory. The English expected a desperate struggle for survival. Neither side fully understood that they were about to witness one of the most revolutionary battles of the Middle Ages, a battle that would forever change how Europe thought about war. Today, the knights died. As the French army assembled before the English position at Crécy, King Philip VI possessed every advantage that medieval warfare was supposed to reward. He had more men, more knights, more noble commanders, and far greater resources. To many observers, the outcome seemed obvious. The English were trapped deep inside hostile territory. Their escape routes were limited. Their army was heavily outnumbered. By traditional standards, defeat should have been inevitable. Yet the Battle of Crécy would expose a harsh reality that much of Europe was not prepared to accept. The age of the Knight was beginning to change. The battle opened with the Genoese crossbowmen. These professional mercenaries formed the front line of the French army and were expected to soften the English defenses before the main attack. But several problems appeared almost immediately. The Genoese had marched for hours. Many were exhausted. Their equipment had suffered during the recent rainstorm. Most importantly, they faced an enemy weapon unlike anything Europe had fully appreciated before, the English longbow. When the Genoese advanced, they launched their first volleys. The results were disappointing. Their shots fell short. Their effectiveness was reduced. Then the English responded. Thousands of longbowmen drew their bows. Witnesses later described the arrows as darkening the sky. Volley after volley crashed into the advancing Genoese ranks. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundred. The crossbowmen hesitated. Some turned back. Others attempted to retreat. For the French commanders watching behind them, the sight was infuriating. The attack had barely begun, and already the front line appeared to be collapsing. What happened next remains one of the most infamous moments in medieval military history. Instead of allowing the Genoese to withdraw, many French knights interpreted the retreat as cowardice. Enraged, they ordered cavalry charges directly through their own troops. Horses thundered forward. The retreating crossbowmen were trampled beneath armored cavalry. Confusion spread instantly. Units became mixed together. Orders disappeared in the chaos. The battle was no longer unfolding according to any coherent plan, and the English had not even been seriously engaged yet. Then came the cavalry attacks. Wave after wave of French knights charged uphill toward the English position. The sight must have been magnificent. Hundreds of armored horsemen advancing beneath noble banners, the military elite of France, the very symbol of medieval warfare. But appearances can be deceptive. As the cavalry advanced, the English archers opened fire again. The result were devastating. Arrows struck horses, animals collapsed, riders were thrown to the ground, momentum disappeared, entire formation broke apart before reaching the English line. Those who survived the arrow storms faced another obstacle, the terrain, the slope slowed their advance. Bodies and wounded horses created barriers. Every new tower encountered the wreckage of the previous one. Instead of building momentum, the French attacks created increasing disorder. Yet the assaults continued, again and again and again. Some estimates suggest more than a dozen major attacks were launched throughout the battle. Each ended in failure. Each produced more casualties. Each weakened the French army further. Among the English defenders stood Edward's 16-year-old son, Edward of Woodstock. History would later remember him as the Black Prince. At one point during the fighting, pressure mounted against his position. Messengers reportedly wrote to King Edward III, requesting reinforcements. The king refused. According to tradition, he replied that his son should be allowed to earn his spurs. Whether the exact words are true remains debated, but the story became legendary. The young prince held his ground. The English line survived, and the battle continued, turning against France. As darkness approached, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. French nobles lay dead across the battlefield. Counts, barons, knights, military commanders. Even John of Bohemia, a blind king who had insisted on joining the fighting, was killed during one of the attacks. The losses among the French aristocracy were staggering. For centuries, medieval warfare had been built around the assumption that heavily armored nobles dominated the battlefield. Crécy challenged that assumption more dramatically than any battle before it. A disciplined infantry force, supported by skilled archers, had shattered one of Europe's most prestigious armies. The consequences extended far beyond a single day. The victory transformed Edward III's reputation. It opened the path toward the Siege of Calais, one of England's most important gains during the Hundred Years' War. Military thinkers across Europe began studying the lessons of the battle. Some learned from them, others ignored them. France, unfortunately, would be among those who learned too slowly. Nearly 70 years later, at Agincourt, many of the same mistakes would be repeated. Again, French knights would charge. Again, English archers would dominate the battlefield. Again, confidence would become catastrophe. That is why Crécy remains one of the most important battles in medieval history. It was not simply an English victory, it was a warning that warfare was changing, a warning that discipline could defeat numbers, and a warning that technology, preparation, and leadership could overcome even the most powerful army in Europe. On that August evening in 1346, the French believed they were witnessing another battle. In reality, they were witnessing the beginning of the end for an entire way of war.